Hi guys. Thank you for joining us for the first forum of our Spring Professional Development Series. I know that the Grad Forum Committee has been talking about, I'm really excited about this spring series, kind of all of last semester, so we're really hoping that it goes over well. So today we're here for, I know that you probably can't read this because that marker was a piece of trash, but conferencing from proposal to presentation. We have three panelists with us. We have Katy Lewis, Dr. Bob Rod, and Krista Roberts, who are going to talk to us about all the things about conferences you could ever possibly want to know, probably. So I'll let you guys, do you have a plan?
Do you want me to start with the...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I want you
so
to start.
I'm going to do that thing where I write on the board because I can't not do that. As I was kind of preparing what I was going to say, sorry, Shelby.
I have a decent marker in my office, which is nearby.
I went and grabbed these
you
fresh
got
new
your
ones
own.
from
Okay.
the thing. So we'll see how that is. So something I was thinking about, right, is I don't know how you all feel, but whenever I go to one of these things, I always wish people would ask what I kind of already know or what I want to get out of the presentation, because it doesn't feel fair to me to just talk about all the stuff if you already know it. But then if I'm already talking as if you know things and you don't know that thing, that can create distance between the audience and the person speaking. So I kind of wanted to start off by asking, what are your experiences with conferences? What are you looking to hear about? Us sort of talk, I think Krista and Bob have very different experiences than I do, so I will talk a lot about sort of mindsets and kind of attitudes that I try to have when I go into a conference, and then they have some specific concrete things to kind of look for. So I just wanted to ask you, what are your experiences? What are you kind of looking to hear from us today? And then I will write it on the board so that we will be sure to remember to do that thing. Sure.
How do you write a proposal?
Thank you, Charlie. Sure. Nina.
How do you write an abstract, and is that the same thing with the proposal?
So we can talk about those differences, yeah.
And a good abstract, not how do you just write one? One that's good, that will actually get into a conference.
I think that would imply
Well,
specifications.
That's okay, we can add in those descriptors. What else? Sure.
When you present at the conference, are you supposed to just read your paper or make a PowerPoint, or how interactive should it be?
Yes. Thanks, Abby.
Can I put a thing?
Yes.
So we talked about from proposal to presentation, and not just presentation as the actual thing that you're doing, but the presentation of yourself at the conference at large.
Oh. The presentation.
Yes, that one.
Sure.
How do you schmooze?
Schmoozing. That's the fun part.
So one thing I will put out there is later on we will have a specific forum about networking. So we'll probably talk a little bit about this, but at least I won't spend my entire time talking about this, because then you would just be going to the same grad forum twice.
That's how networking builds on conferencing.
Yeah. So we'll say a little bit, but we'll have it in the back of our minds. What else?
I guess funding, if you can't afford to go yourself.
Krista will be killing it with the advice over there.
Got 2 kidneys.
That's why you have 2 kidneys.
You have an extra for that reason, right?
Well,
what else?
liver regenerates.
Sure.
I feel like it would be worthwhile talking about how many to go to, right, and which ones to go to, because I've heard a lot of different advice from, going to 4 or 5 a year, and then some people being whoa, calm it down, 2 is enough, that sort of thing, kind of overkill.
Great question.
Katie, could I add to that maybe talking about the differences across sub-areas for thinking about that?
Yes. this for representative? Oh, sorry, Blake, yes.
What's the difference between a panel and presenting?
So panel versus presenting, is that what you said?
Yeah, sure.
I'll put also
Like
slash
proposing a panel or
presentation.
All parts.
We will talk about it
Proposing
all.
a panel, proposing versus,
Sure.
well, I already know what a proposal for presentation is.
Yeah, okay. Abby?
Are there any differences between, like, besides, like, who it's for, between a graduate conference and just, like, a regular conference?
Anything else? Yes.
Related to that, at what point do you start knocking off the graduate conferences from your CV? Like at what number, you know what I mean? Is that making sense?
Yes.
May I suggest that somebody who's sort of in charge get a photo of this to go along with the audio recording?
When do you knock off grad? I don't know why I did that. Okay. Does this feel good? Anything else? No? Okay.
Can we add questions later?
Yes.
No.
No, these are the only things we're not talking about anything else. If it's not on the board now, you're done.
I know this is called a forum.
It's 3:10. It's 3:10. The questions are over.
Exactly, no questions. So I guess do you all want me to start?
Sure.
So, I basically made this document, which is why I have my handy dandy little computer thing because my printer hates me. That kind of goes through like applying, presenting the actual paper thing, and then kind of how you act at a conference. And I'm happy to give that to Shelby to pass on to other people if you would like to see this. I tried to write it in a way as if I was actually speaking to you. So thinking about applying, right? A little bit on my background. I have gone to 12 conferences. I've presented at 11. I think there's a mixture of like 4 or 5 different kinds in there. And I started presenting when I was an undergrad. So I often feel like I'm in this weird position because, of course, I'm very proud that I started presenting early and that I had those experiences. But now that I've been doing it so long, I find myself often reverting to that, well, I'm still the student position. And so a lot of what I wanted to talk about is kind of realizing that as you're going into these conferences, you are not just a graduate student. And I've had experiences where lots of amazing scholars have been kind and welcoming to graduate students. And I've had experiences where it's not that they haven't been welcoming, but they have said things in certain ways that made it clear that I'm just a graduate student. So the first thing I would say is, why are you applying to a conference? Besides the fact that we all have to do this thing apparently in academia, right? So are you just like interested in this particular field? Do you feel pretty confident in it? Like you know people, you know what you want to talk about, you feel good about your work. Are you trying to gain experience without a high stakes environment? Do you want to do stuff in your field? You know about this conference, but it doesn't let in a ton of individual people, but you have some really kick-ass awesome friends, right? So these are kind of how I've broken it down. And so one thing I would suggest is that if you are a person who has never presented before, I would not apply to that big name, the conference that everyone goes to, because the likelihood of you getting in can be slimmer. Not to say that you shouldn't try that thing, but if you're putting all your effort into this one conference and that doesn't work out, what else do you have left, right? So then I would also say, I feel good about presenting things because I am a people person, but I still get crazy, crazy nervous. I feel like my stomach's gonna fall out of my body. I can't feel my hands because they're so cold. Like I feel really hot and sweaty, and I get super nervous about doing that even though I've been doing it for a little while. So I would say that if you're someone who hasn't done a lot of conferences, try to find a low stakes environment. So a lot of grad conferences are good for that because you're in an environment where you are all graduate students, so you know that maybe you don't have a lot of experience, maybe you're still trying to figure out where you are in your field, and you don't have to worry about having someone like this big name scholar breathing down your neck, which a lot of them aren't like that. I should also say I'm in children's literature, and children's literature is a very close-knit, tight, wonderful community, with like exceptions as all places are, right? So I can't speak to those other fields, which hopefully Bob and Krista will be able to say. But that would be my first thing. Figure out why you're applying, and then that will help you look for what conference that you would that you would work in. If you're feeling really confident, go for that bigger name conference. So in children's literature, it's the Children's Literature Association, as well as I would say the International Research Society for Children's Literature. International conferences are super awesome because you get to meet people from all over the world and really realize how Western and American centralized we are, which is not necessarily a problem, but people have different takes, different research practices, and I think it can really broaden your mind, but it can be expensive. And so I know Krista has been to international conferences. I've been to international conferences, and so we can talk a little bit more about funding. How to be cheap. Number one, don't go by yourself. Jen and I went to a conference over the summer, and not only was it great because we got to live together for a week, but it was nice because I had somebody. So that's the first thing I'll say. And then the other thing that I will say is I really want to emphasize, don't let other people treat you as if you are just a graduate student, because your ideas matter. Your research matters. And even if you don't feel super confident in it, the fact that you are trying out these new ideas and doing those sorts of things, it's important. And you're not just a graduate student. And I'm saying this because whenever I present, I always get really worried that someone who's like done more research on this thing is gonna call me out. And it's like, you can disagree with big name people. That's like, okay, that's part of being a scholar. So don't feel like that you can't put yourself out there. Anything you all want to add to that before I continue?
You're great.
Oh, okay. The other big thing that I will say is, we often talk about presenting at conferences, but the first time I ever went to CHLA, I didn't present. I just went. And, I had in my undergrad, they paid for everything because I was an undergraduate student and people didn't go, right? So that was really lucky. But if you have the opportunity to go, even for a day or just to listen to people talk, you can get to know the field. You can get to know how people present things. You know, what's the culture of presentation? Do people do PowerPoints? Do people just stand up there and read? Do people have interactive presentations? What kinds of work are people doing? How are they bringing in other fields and that sort of stuff? And then doing that can kind of get you to know other people so that maybe you decide to submit a panel. So one of the questions, right, was submitting, being on a panel versus presenting or being on a presentation. So anytime that you present, you are on a panel. I would say typically 3 to 4 people, right? But you can also submit as a panel. So for instance, say Krista, Bob, and I all had somehow interests that intersected and we could bring in each of our fields, but we had an idea of how a panel would go together. Rather than just presenting as Krista, Bob, and me, we could submit as a panel and say, we have an idea of how all of this could work. And often for larger conferences, that might be a way to get you in, because I feel like I've heard some rec comp people talk about that with Cs. So you all can speak to that a little bit more. And I did that at CHLA one year, and it was pretty great. There were some rough spots, but we can talk about that later. Okay, so about presenting. Also, if you have questions as they come up, just like yell at me to stop talking. But about presenting, right? You're doing the thing. First off, don't take yourself so seriously that you can't have fun, right? Your work should be interesting. It should be fun. You should be enjoying what you're doing. So if you're just that person who reads like this, presenting, you did the thing, but you've got more to do. Take yourself seriously, right? Like, nobody's going to want to listen to your work. Like, you don't want to listen to someone drone on for a long time. So think about the sorts of things that you like. Dr. Karen Coates always likes to talk about how there's a difference between an oral presentation and a written presentation. And going back to the reading versus how to present other things, I've done presentations where I have a PowerPoint with me and I use that because I'm using a lot of images. I've done presentations where I just read. I had a presentation one time where I wasn't allowed to read my paper. I was only allowed to explain my paper. So, right. So rather than sitting here reading this, I had to figure out how I'm supposed to explain all of my theory, all of my points, and explain it to you without actually reading my paper, which takes a totally different thing, right? So one thing as you're kind of thinking about how to present, again, figure out the culture of that conference. What do a lot of people do? What work are you doing, and what is the best way to present it? So if you're doing something with picture books, it would probably be helpful to have the pictures that you're referencing, right? So think about like multimodal and multimedia stuff. Okay, let's see. Also, this took me, I had a bad experience one time where I wrote 13 pages for a conference paper. And I was stupid because I knew I shouldn't have done that thing, but I did, right? Most conference papers are 8 to 10 pages because most presentations are 15 to 20 minutes. Sometimes in other places they might give you 25, but still, you are not writing an article, you are not writing a thesis or a dissertation, you are writing a conference paper. So if you have ideas that are bigger, that's great, keep that information, but also realize that timing is important. You don't want to be droning on for 30 minutes if you were supposed to be cut off at 15. Because some conferences will just immediately cut you off. And then some conferences I've been to where the person went on for 45 minutes and other people didn't get to talk because the moderator didn't cut them off. So that's one way to be professional, right? Be aware of your time.
So either they're going to cut you off or they're going to silently hate you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
One or the other.
Right. Don't read like you want your presentation to be over. Don't, right? I know I talk really fast. And when we get nervous, we talk even faster. And if you were reading so quickly, if you're reading like this, don't read like you want it to be over. This goes back to the thing about remember this in oral, like nobody is going to understand what you were saying. Take a deep breath. Practice reading your presentation before you actually present. Have people sit and listen. That's what Jen and I did at our conference, and that was really helpful because not only do you realize like, okay, you started speeding up in this section and I lost where you were, but I also like to go through and I like to highlight those words that I know I have trouble pronouncing, especially words that have a lot of S's together. For some reason, like my mouth gets really tongue-tied and like it just is like a jumble and it doesn't make sense. So I will go through and I'll highlight and remind myself. Also, look up how to pronounce people's names. Like it's not Foucault, it's Foucault. It's not Jacques Lacan, it's Jacques Lacan, right? So it's not, you know what I mean? Like look up those sorts of things because especially if you have someone whose name is hard to pronounce and they happen to be in the room listening to your presentation but you've never seen them, that could be really awkward. And
really entertaining for everybody else.
Exactly, it is. So everybody else will be laughing at you, but you will be wanting the floor to open up and swallow you. So don't do that. And so the last thing I'll talk about presenting a little bit is I always freak out over the number of questions I get at the end of the panel. So I read my paper, everybody reads their paper, we have questions. I've had it where nobody has asked questions, and I'm like, did you hate my work? Did you not understand me? Was I stupid? Like, what is going on here, right? And then I've had panels where I get like 5 of the 7 questions and I'm like, did you not understand what I said? Do you not like what I said, right? There's really no rhyme or reason to it. Like, sometimes you don't get any questions because everybody was like, wow, your paper was clear. I got what you said. I didn't have anything to disagree with. Yeah, cool. And that's great. And then sometimes you get 5 questions because people are like, I've never thought about it like this before. So don't take any of those sorts of things personally. And so I'll pause here to also say, I haven't had an experience where someone has attacked me after a presentation, but I was going to ask if either of you had that experience or seen that experience and how you went about handling that. Because my response would be like, don't come at me, but that's not professional. So I'm like waiting for the day and I'm concerned. Anyway.
I have.
Okay.
You go first.
You? There's two that come to mind immediately. One was came down to the constraints of my paper and the time that I had and what I was talking about for that time, right? Because conference papers are largely you're fleshing out ideas, you're workshopping them to be part of larger work. And I thought that I had explained this, and I had not, and someone in the audience would not drop that I had left men out of a conversation on breast cancer. I was like, this is really important, and I see, in the future that's definitely a direction. But I think it's important, that I develop this work first, but he would not drop it. And it got to the point where he was actually standing up and yelling at me. So what you do then, or what I did, was always have something in front of you that you can just sort of scribble down, like, oh my God, why is this happening to me? What have I done in a past life to make this happen?
To get your actual feelings out.
Right?
Yeah.
Or you can take a sip of water. You'll actually, if you people watch at conferences, which you should do, you'll see someone take a sip of water if they start to get nervous, that kind of thing. So you just maintain your professionalism, and you can kind of redirect it like, well, do you have any other comments or questions about what I presented today? Because it sounds like I can't clarify this for you. Or we can talk about it more afterwards. I know I want to make sure that the rest of the people on the panel have time to have their questions addressed. That kind of thing, just sort of sideways maneuver and then go into the bathroom and do what you got to do. The other one was, I guess it was sort of the same thing, just different context. But I had other people in the audience. It was my life writing family. So there were other people in the audience who sort of helped pull that into a different direction for me, which was nice, but that rarely happens.
Yeah.
So just make sure the first thing that you need to do is realize that you're not in any physical danger.
Even though it might feel that way.
It may feel that way. But just take a deep breath and then calmly think through, like, okay, how can I help bring this back to the important work that we're here to do at a conference? Because this person, can't see past their anger right now, which, academics, our work is very intimate, right? And sometimes it's difficult to negotiate that immediately.
Yeah.
So there's...
I'll only very briefly say two things about this kind of nightmare scenario where you're presenting and somebody attacks you. Number one, it's extremely rare.
Yes.
It's extremely rare. People are generally welcoming and supportive and engaged. And sure, they might ask a critical question, but that's what you're there for. It does happen. So very briefly, I was a doctoral student at Miami of Ohio. It's a conference on portfolio assessment, and I had a talk in the program, and one of the keynote speakers, Ed White, was giving his talk, and then he named the title of my talk, which was Portfolio Scoring, a Contradiction in Terms, ? And he didn't name me, but he said, this is an example of a very dangerous line of thinking, because we need to be able to score portfolios reliably and efficiently in order to keep them going. And so I just kind of was in the back row of the conference and breathing deeply and just kind of handling that. And there was question and answer time, and I just waited, and it was the last question. I just stood up and I said, Professor White, my name is Bob Broad. My paper is the one you mentioned, Portfolio Scoring, a Contradiction in Terms. I just want to invite you to attend my talk tomorrow and hear me make my case.
Nice.
And so this is kind of a famous story, because here's the graduate student, politely engaging the big guy, and he did come to my talk, and it was a fantastic professional opportunity for me all the way around. He did me this huge favor by picking on me, so keep that in mind.
People showed up for the...
Yeah, it's an adverse moment can turn into something very positive depending on how you handle it.
Yes. So that segues into the last thing I'll talk about, which is just how to act and be a person at conferences in general. And I really resist the urge to act as if I am so academic and professional, I have no other personality. And of course I'm professional. There are panels that I go to where I'm like, I can't believe that person just presented that. Like, wow, like I really don't agree, or it seems like their research is out of date, but I am still professional, right? But at the end of the day, once the panels are over, get to know people. In talking with people in general about conferences, like, I know I'm an extrovert, so I have no problem going up to someone and being like, hey, how's it going? What's your name? My name's Katie. Like, do you want to, like, hang out with us? I see you haven't been hanging out with people, just because that's who I am, right? But if that's not who you are, you're going to have to come up with some strategies to figure out how to not only take advantage of the papers and the panels, but also the people, right? There are going to be events and things at these conferences where they might like take you out into the city and the area that you're in to get you to see the sorts of resources that they have. Don't blow those off. You've paid for the conference, do some of those, right? I like to think about how sometimes conferences can be this really weird vibe of like, this seems like a vacation because I'm in a place that I've never been before, but this is also a professional environment, right? So do enjoy yourself. Go out and have a drink if that's what you like to do. I mean, don't get so drunk you can't like make it to your panel, but like go out and see the food, like go see a museum or stuff, but don't only go to one panel presentation and then blow off the rest of the conference. Because if you are getting funding, that is part of an ethical decision that you're making. You have to use that funding appropriately. So, enjoy your visit. Don't just hole up in your hotel room. Go find shops and different things, right? So I have been to a conference in England. I've been to a conference in Toronto. I've been to South Carolina. I've been to Seattle. These are all beautiful, amazing places that I would never get to go to otherwise because I don't have the money and somehow think it's okay to spend lots of money on conferences, but whatever. Right. But I really try to enjoy that place and get to know people. I have friends now who live in Sweden and Finland who are hosting the next big Children's Literature International conference that I got to know at the first conference that I went to. I'm friends with them on Facebook. One of them is an editor for a journal, and like I went out to dinner with them, right? If I hadn't have put aside like, okay, well, I'm just a grad student, like I'm still very young. If I hadn't have put aside that attitude and realized, okay, I'm just gonna talk to this person as if they're a person, I would never have these sorts of connections that I made. So, relax, be yourself, be a human being, but be a professional. When you find yourself in those positions where you just want to like rip someone's hair out, sip your water and don't do that because that's not professional.
Because that's what everybody remembers about
Exactly. You don't want to be that person that people talk about at conferences, which I want to be positive, so I won't keep talking about that. But those are kind of my little thingies, and I'm happy to send this to you if you would like it, but that's what I'll say so far.
Next. Okay. Am I going to be loud enough?
Sure. We'll hand you the microphone.
Can you hear me? Hello. So I've been very fortunate to have a number of scholars help me and affectionately refer to me as their academic daughter, which is kind of creepy at times, but nonetheless, we spend a lot of time with each other, and some conferences feel like family reunions at times. Yeah. But I'm going to be riffing off of a book called The Professor is In. I know, has anyone heard of that? It's a very good advice book. I highly recommend it, and the subsequent blog. I have an electronic version. I know there's a way to loan it to people, but you'll have to tell me how to do that. I don't know.
That's Karen Kelsey, right?
Yes. And in there, she passes on some advice that was given to her, and that is she suggests a line on your CV for each month. And at first, when I sat down and thought about this, it was like 12 months. Oh my God. And I was like, wait, well, there's really like 9 months that were, in the academic year. So I'll just sort of cut it to 9. And as long as I'm adding about 5 to 9 lines on my CV a year, I feel pretty comfortable. Kelsey also continues in this section to talk about the differences between lines, which is where I'm going to be entering conversation about conferences. So small local conferences are good when you're first starting out, but if you've got 5 local conferences and nothing else, when you go to apply for a job, they're not really going to get a sense that you're participating fully in the academic conversation. You're really good at talking to your community, and that's important and valuable, but you need to be branching out, and that's a lot what they're looking for in job interviews. Also, helping someone else run a conference is nice to do a couple of times, but you need to make sure that your name is first on several projects too. And this again, you sort of weight it out on your CV so it gets a picture of, look, I can work with others, but also I can take charge and do the thing myself. And conferencing is certainly part of this, and the kinds of conferences that you're attending help to paint this picture, to use that tired metaphor. Conferencing is also how you get feedback on your work when you're no longer a student. So when you attend, the way that I'm writing my papers now is very much different than when I was just a first-year master's student. I have this idea now, and I need to be able to talk about it with somebody, and these are the people who are going to be reading the eventual article. So I want to hear what they have to say and what they think, and listen to them contribute to my work too. And then you get to contribute to theirs too, which I think is important that we're sort of leaving out a little bit for now. You should be asking questions in panels as well. Don't just take from people, you need to give back. It's terrifying at first, but again, go back to people watching and how are they phrasing their questions? Okay, well, what kinds of questions are they asking, right? What kinds of questions do I like getting? What kinds of questions do I not like getting? And that'll help you figure out how to frame a question. I know there's a lot of jokes on the internet about academia and having long, rambly questions, but sometimes you got to do a little bit of contextual work before you actually get to the meat of what it is that you're going to be doing. So don't let the online culture of making fun of ourselves really influence the way that you approach this, and I hope it's not discouraging. So now I'm going to start talking about money. So regional conferences are sort of brilliant if you're on a budget. We have a number of them available in the Midwest within like a 5-hour time range. There's the Midwest Modern Language Association, happens every year the weekend before Thanksgiving. And I'm personally surprised not more students from ISU attend these, but that you can usually get a group of people to go. It's usually within driving range. This past year it was in Cincinnati. The time before it was in St. Louis. Thank you. It was
I
like
went to that one.
Yeah.
I stayed with 3 other students from ISU, and there was probably like 10 of us all together. It was good. Anyway.
Exactly. Well, you get to share costs and that kind of thing. So, and then if you get enough people together, you can find a faculty member who might be attending. You can ask the department for a university van. That being said, there are pluses and minuses to the big red beast. That someone has to take a driving test just so they make sure you're not going to crash university property. So you need to have someone who's a confident driver and is okay with someone standing there watching you parallel park a large van with the university logo on it. However, that can really help with costs, especially if it's something local. So the conference hotel may seem mandatory, but it's not. Oftentimes they'll get a discounted rate and you look at it and you're like, it's still $200 a night. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the discount.
Right, like what was it before, right? So The way I approach that is I weigh the decision to book a room in the hotel versus somewhere else cheaper or within my budget with how much is it going to be to travel from this other place to the conference every day. How many days am I going to be there? If it's a one-day thing and I've only got to pay for a taxi once, it might be okay. But also if it's a major city where the taxi bill is going to wind up being about like $50 and it might wind up being a wash with what you're saving on the hotel room. And it could be more convenient to just walk downstairs in the morning. You've got that extra time. But that's something that I wish someone would have pointed out to me sooner was you don't have to stay in the same hotel. And then sometimes you'll see, you'll catch a taxi with somebody else and you can force them to be your friend because they're in the same hotel that you are, away from everybody, and you can bond and go get dinner. That's happened before. You can also go to a grocery store. So while we are encouraging you to go to the big after hours light cocktails and drinks with everybody, which always seems to be at a really expensive bougie place. You can just order something nice and small, or like a small drink, have a glass of water or something, be there for a couple hours or so, talk to everybody, have your social obligation, and then go to a grocery store and eat your real meal. I've done that before. You know, major cities in particular, there's going to be very few restaurant options that are actually, I think, graduate student budget.
Seattle was.
Yeah. Seattle, for real, yeah. Chicago, too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I always try to do like one, I will splurge on one thing and then I'm cheap the rest of the time because I just don't have that money. But
Yes.
Of course, if you drive together, you can pack food too.
If you can pack food, especially if it's a one-day thing. Seminars at libraries, the Newberry Library is always doing things. That's good to show up and put your face at, especially if you're in literature, which I am in. You should go to the outings. Go to the graduate student outings, because those are the people who, you are part of the people that are going to be taking over the field eventually. So if you can start to make friends now and network now, that's the thing that you want to do.
And then later on, you can be like, hey, none of the people from my school are going to this conference, but I know you're going to this conference. Do you want to split a hotel room?
Absolutely.
So I have a friend who, from undergrad actually, she's also in children's literature now, and she's from Texas A&M. So I'm always going to be hitting her up because she goes to tons and tons of conferences, which is also just generally wonderful. But anyway.
And you get this external community of support that once you leave graduate school, you're not really going to have anymore. There's a lot of, I'll stop there. You want to make sure that you're building your support and your writing network and your et cetera. I know you're going to talk about that at a later date, but it's important, and a lot of that happens here.
Yes.
So you've got to sort of find a way to talk yourself into going and doing the thing, even when you're super tired. That involves going to other panels too. Not only to people watch and see how they're doing it, but see what other questions people are asking of work in your field.
And there's sometimes when you go to a conference and you're looking at the panels and you're like, okay, a lot of this stuff is not interesting to me. Even though it might not be interesting, still trying to find those little nuggets, because then you'll go and you'll be like, okay, I didn't know anything about this and I didn't think I was interested in this, but that's super cool and now I'm gonna remember that. So really do take advantage of those presentations. Don't just go to one panel and then not do anything else.
And something else that I've done before is I'll hang back at panel start time and just sort of look and see like, okay, well, there's 3 people in this room. I'm going to go in there and smile at them because I know what it's like to have 2 people in the room who've already read my presentation before, right? So if you go there and you smile and you seem interested, that does a lot to build your character in the field. And it's also something that I would like to have, so might as well put it in the universe, right? But back to, right, make friends, split costs with travel. Children's lit people, I know there's a lot of you. Start splitting your costs. I told you to do it. The rhetoric, a lot of us are super specialized in our own fields, but we intersect at an international or national conference. So something that looks big and expensive, if there's a group of people applying for this, then you can certainly negotiate costs or mitigate costs with that. In terms of transportation, I personally love flying, but driving too. When you're attending with a large group, again, that university van, it's big and goofy, but it's cheap, right? Flights, the ideal time to book a flight, domestic, is 6 weeks out. That's when the price drop happens. After 6 weeks, it jumps back up. And 8 weeks for international. I just booked a round trip ticket to San Francisco for under $300. No big deal. You also, I want to encourage you to get on a travel rewards program. You can start accumulating points now. You may not be able to redeem it right now when you kind of really need it, but you're going to be building it, and it'll be something that you have in the future. So hotels, flights, if you want to get one with American and someone else gets one with Delta, then you and your friend can just make sure you use each other's, right? Just sort of, that way you don't have to organize a million of these different reward programs, which can get overwhelming from experience. Everyone has their own secret travel website. I found mine is justfly.com. But sometimes they can get a little spammy. But not like the canned meat, but in a bad way. Funding. Before I launch into asking people for money, I want to tell you that you should always send out your abstract and or proposal before you decide that you don't have the money.
Yes.
Otherwise, that will be the reason why you never do anything, because you're always going to find that you can spend money on other things.
Yes.
And the first step to this is getting in, because you're not going to need to use the money until you get in. So you might as well apply, have them tell you yes, and then you can figure out how you're going to pay for it. That being said, make sure that if you do decide that you can't attend, that you tell them nicely that you cannot and you don't totally flake.
And you also do it not the day before the conference.
Don't do it the day before or 2 hours after your panel.
Yes. Because there have been times where that's happened, and then there's one person on a 4-person panel, and it's like, well, that's not even a panel. Yes.
But those can be fun too. I actually
Yes,
find
you're
I have the
saying,
most
okay, I
fun
have
when
this
there's
whole
one
hour.
person on the panel. It's a lot more intimate. So the department offers $200 every year to graduate students. You should apply for that every year. The College of Arts and Sciences offers a grant of $250. They offer quite a bit more for pedagogy presentations, both for primary research and for presenting your pedagogy research. So that's something that if you're in that, or you can argue that you're in that, then make sure that that's your name's applying for that. I know for international conferences, there's I think it's one award. The details to this are in the graduate handbook, and I'm a sinner and haven't read the most recent version. I read last year's version. They allow for like one grant of $1,000 to a graduate student for international travel every year. That may or may not have changed. It might have dropped given our current funding situation. So don't immediately talk yourself out of that.
Yeah, I will say the international conferences that I've been to, they're of course the most expensive. But when I went, they like had a whole housing thing that I could do alongside my actual conference registration, which then the housing also had like food and stuff. So it ended up beating it. The price seemed really expensive, but it would have been just as expensive to try to do things on my own, and it was very convenient. So.
And a lot of conferences will they'll find funding afterwards. They need to allow like X number of graduate students, and they have to wait to send in a grant. And they'll, sometimes I've had them email me and say, by the way, you get your registration fee back because we found money for it. I'm like, that's amazing. So they'll oftentimes really be looking to fund graduate students and to get you there. So again, make sure you send in that abstract and have them tell you no before you tell yourself no. And don't use it as an excuse for your anxiety. With international conferences, though, you want to make sure that you are making the decision that this conference is important and it is valuable to you and your field and your career future. And not just an exotic location that you really want to go to, that there happens to be a conference there.
Right.
If there's not somebody who looks like, who's publishing in the journals that you're constantly citing, then think twice about attending that and spending the money on going there, right? So I know the Huntington Library, if you do work with archival materials, they actually have a travel award where they will give you money and they will pay for your flight and give you $3,000 a month to go and work in a different archive. You don't even need to be at theirs. They do have funding for theirs too. They have a long-term and short-term. So look at, I'm not sure what the Newberry's, what they're offering, but this is the one I'm familiar with because I just applied for it. So, larger projects will oftentimes offer, you can write into your grant conference travel funding, and don't let that intimidate you now. If you're early career, this is something that you should get in practice of now because it's part of your job description. This is something that you're going to be doing and that people are going to be paying you to do, is to go and write these grants and hopefully get them, right? So just sort of, it's good to practice now when you've got a little bit more grace to mess things up or to practice, right? Than when you're a fully fledged faculty, right? They're a little less forgiving. You can also find funding opportunities and conference opportunities through academic Twitter. I have a Twitter handle that's purely for academic purposes. I'm tweeting at conferences. They'll have a handle or hashtag for the conference, and I always make sure I send out a tweet with that so that other people looking at that can see my name in there.
My friend Krista Roberts live tweets some like special meetings for conferences. Like they'll have like a meeting for the members of the organization, right? So she'll live tweet those sorts of things, the conversation that's going on. She'll live tweet people's presentations, and she has had super success getting to know other people just because of that. So put that out there.
Other ways to find opportunities include listservs. I think the Digital Rhetoric people have a couple listservs. The International Autobiography Association, IALBA, has a listserv, and there's constantly CFPs and funding opportunities posted to that. HNet, if you've never heard of it, go and do it today. We'll set one up for you. They've got a number of different listservs, and people are constantly publishing CFPs, both conference calls for paper and calls for chapters, calls for publications, etc., book reviews, which you shouldn't do too much of, but that's different. So that's another way, and definitely something that you should be paying attention to. Helps you get an idea of who's running the conferences in your field too. You should also look at special issues from the journals that you're citing. They'll oftentimes, not necessarily conference proceedings, but they'll have this special issue is taken from presentations at blah conference. Well, if they keep publishing the articles developed at that conference, then that's the conference that you want to be at, right? Just to get yourself into that conversation. I think most of my other notes are primarily for Q&A. So I guess I'll pass on to Dr. Broad Bob.
Hi. How are you holding up? So the grad forums end at 4?
We have the room until 4:30.
Okay.
It's 4:30.
Well, I'd like some guidance because I could be pretty quick with what I do. To leave time for questions and answers by 4, or I don't know.
All of your knowledge.
Well,
That's
okay.
fine. That you can get in the next.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
thinking, but we still
We're
only
gonna
have
do
room.
25 minutes.
Okay, I'll be pretty quick. So first I want to say thanks to the folks who organized the forum and who invited me. It's exciting to be part of what you're doing here. And I love what you're doing. I love the questions and the things that Katy and Krista shared. So I'm going to briefly add a little bit, and then I hope there'll be more discussion. I'm going to try to do two things. Tell a very quick story about an experience I had that I think would be valuable to you to hear about when I was a reviewer of proposals for the 4Cs 2018 conference, and the reviewing happened last summer in Urbana, Illinois. And then I hope to say a few words about when you're actually, live presenting at the conference. A couple of thoughts I have about that. So I don't know how many of you are in writing studies and are likely to attend or present at 4Cs. Some of you. I know some of you are presenting.
Not this year.
Okay, yeah.
Purposefully.
Yeah. Anyway, Asao anyway is the chair this year, and he's a friend of mine, and I admire him a lot. If you know Asao and his work, you won't be surprised by the way he put together his call for proposals, which is detailed and thoughtful and chock full of quotations from other people, including in other languages. And so this was the call for proposals, and I mention it to you and show it to you because a call for proposals is intended to provide guidance to people about, how they should propose things. That's what a call for proposals does. So anyway, this is Asao's version of it. There he is, good-looking fellow, and there's a lot there in the call for proposals. So there's a lot to be digested. And the thing I'll say is simply, I'm always respectful of the call for proposals and the theme. The theme this year is languaging, laboring, and transforming. However, I pretty much never, and this is true from the start when I was a graduate student, I pretty much never do the thing where you put the keywords from the theme in your presentation title, because it just feels kind of like sucking up. I mean, if there's a really strong way you could make that connection, okay. But mainly, I would just respectfully learn about the theme and then tell them what you have to offer to the professional conversation. You don't have to have the keywords in your title. It gets, both as a reviewer but also just as a person attending the conference, it gets kind of tiresome when everybody's title has languaging, laboring, or transforming in it. It feels to me like a block to getting at what people are really trying to do. Okay, so then I helped review many proposals. There was 15 or 20 of us down in Urbana for a few days. We had a great time. We worked really hard. And there were these criteria for review. So remember, there was, what was that, like 3,000 words from Asao in the call for proposals. But here's a 5-point rubric, if you will, for how we, the reviewers, evaluated the proposals. And I don't know how well you can see it, but I'll just tell you the highlights. The first one I actually wanted to call your attention to specifically. Well, okay, so context. Asao called us together when we were finished with our reviewing. He said, let's debrief. What advice would you give to people submitting proposals? And I just kind of jumped in half jokingly and said, read the criteria for review and do those things. That would be my main piece of advice. Because you'd be amazed at how many proposals didn't do these things, and most of them were rejected as a result. I mean, these are things that we have told the world, we have committed to the world that we're going to evaluate the proposals according to these criteria. So we're pretty much locked into that. If you don't do that, you're not going to be in the program. So criteria number 1 is the proposal situated contextually in writing theory, research traditions, or current issues and or practices. And the word situated is bolded. The notion is show that you know what you're talking about. Yes?
Do all the proposals, like all the call for papers, have these criteria and reviews?
No.
Okay.
Nope. I mean, I respect that. I don't know if this was Asao's idea or if 4Cs has done this before, but I respect that they're trying to be transparent. They mentioned this transparency idea in the little preamble there. But yeah, the simple answer is no. So I would say, I was thinking about that. I would say what you do, if there are no explicit criteria, is you induce them from the call for proposal. You try to figure out what they're looking for. But honestly, like contextualizing your argument or your idea in what the field is already talking about should be a thing you always do.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the reviewers don't know whether you know what you're talking about. They don't know whether you're going to waste people's time. Is the proposal focused on the scene of laboring and or languaging to occur during the session presentation? So this is an unusual one. ASAO called for people to explain like who's going to be doing what in the room during the presentation. Usually it's like they're listening, I'm talking, but that wasn't going to be satisfactory. He wanted something more engaging. So that was a criterion. Is the proposal innovative? That should be happening in your proposals. Is you're listening to the professional conversation, but you need to have something that you want to contribute. That is your opening to be a researcher, to create new knowledge. And hopefully you have found something innovative to say. Is the proposal audience-oriented, transformative? Does the proposal address how it adds a new or underrepresented voice or texture to the conversation? Okay, so those are the criteria by which we evaluated, and the key was, if you know the criteria, try to meet them, and then you increase your odds of being on the program. The other thing I want to say really quickly is, there's a somewhat controversial question about, and it's already been touched upon today, should you read the thing you're sharing, or should you do something more, the word I ended up with was more performative? I'm a pretty big fan of not reading at people in almost any situation, because people can read, and therefore I think something should be happening. If people are traveling to Seattle or Toronto or London to hear you speak, I feel like something ought to be happening there other than you're just verbally giving them the thing to read. This is not a universal view. I'm sharing my point of view. And so what I favor, and again, this has been true for me from the beginning, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I always have quotations from the participants in my studies, and that's what I really want to highlight. So if I have a slideshow, that's what's going to be on my slides, the things that the people in my study said. And so I'm going to talk about the themes that I arrived at analyzing these data, but I'm going to make those voices the thing that is on the slide and that is read. And so I try to have a structure, and I try to be very respectful about time limits so that there will be time for questions and answers. I really do, I'm somewhat fanatical about this. So yeah, stay within your time constraints. And when you're planning out the panel, I'm notorious for always saying, let's talk for less time than that so there's more time for questions and answers.
Yeah.
Because people always go over, and half of the time at 4Cs, when we're supposed to know, where we're supposed to know better, there's no time for questions and answers. I'm like, what are you doing? Again, 40 people came to this room really for a conversation, and you just made it impossible for the conversation to happen. So I hope you won't do that. So respect the time limits, and I would say give yourself a structure, but I'm not in favor of reading at people. People will give you 5 good reasons that you should read. You have more control over how much time you take. You won't get lost. You won't forget important things. There are reasons to do it. I just feel like you'll lose your audience if you're reading them. Like 90% of the ways in which I care about your connection with your audience, I feel like you lost them if you're standing there and reading at them. That's what I have to share. Thanks.
So as Krista and Dr. Broad were talking, I decided to type up these questions, and because some of them have already sort of been answered, but I also am a person who likes to have a thing. So if you want this document, I have typed up the questions, and I'm also seeing where we haven't answered some of the questions that you already have. So if you have questions right now that you want to ask, go ahead and do that, and then I'll get back to the ones that I noticed we haven't really talked about yet. Ha.
Can I just say a thing about moderating?
Yes.
Because that's something that hasn't been brought up.
Yes,
and,
I feel your girl.
Somebody, I guess, taught me this in my first conference, and it was super helpful. And then I talked to other people, and no one ever really tells you what a moderator's role is. So just for what it's worth, because I found this to be really helpful. When you start going to conferences, people might ask you to moderate panels, and I think that you should, because it's a good experience. It's something you can put on a CV. It's really not that difficult, right? But as a moderator, you have a unique responsibility not only to keep time. A lot of people think that moderators are only responsible for keeping time, and that definitely is important. But the moderator's role is to make sure that every single person on that panel gets at least one question. Because you go and you present work and you work hard and you've spent so much money to be there, and when you don't get a single question, it just really sucks. And so if y'all ever do end up moderating the panel, I think that part of the ethical responsibility is to listen and take notes and make sure that every single person gets a question, because there's always one paper that's gonna like get all the attention, and so it's your job to find a segue to the person who's not. So I just wanted to add that.
And it's usually the last paper presented that gets the most questions, simply because that's the one people remember the best.
Can I just add to what Jeff
please.
said too, that just like volunteering at conferences in general is also a good way to like meet people and feel more comfortable. And most conferences usually, when you apply, you have a checkbox to volunteer to, don't volunteer to review proposals for a conference when you've never been there before, right? Because that's dangerous and unfair to other people. But like there are ways that you can volunteer, and they might have you do other things around the conference, and then you meet other people from their schools.
I had a unique opportunity when NCTE was held like in the Washington DC area. So people from the Virginia one, we all went up and volunteered at the NCTE one. And so I'm at this huge conference that I've never been to before, and they're all, I mean, like, it's crazy big, but I got this opportunity to see how things worked behind the scenes, how did they organize things, how did they handle things, and that will that can help you decide whether you want to go to that conference, not just because of the kinds of work that they're doing, but also because of the kinds of people there are. Because I'm a big person, like, I want to be the kind of academic that not only does good work, but is also a good person. And so if like the people that you are constantly surrounding yourself by are just really negative about the kinds of work that you're doing, or have negative interactions with, that's not going to promote great work. So far I've had lovely experiences, but anyway. Anyone else? Sure.
I'm not sure about this question, if it will be applicable to everyone or not, but like, I found myself applying for a conference last fall that had a very specific theme, like, where it seemed very narrow, like just Frankenstein, rather than something more abstract. And then I noticed that of the things accepted, a lot of things weren't even dealing with like Frankenstein. So when proposing, when working on abstracts, how do you decide like how far away from the central theme you can go, I guess?
I think that one's for you.
I was just about to say that.
Okay, I didn't recognize that, but I'm going to respond. I don't know if this is just going to sound, if this will be helpful or not, but what I would say is, okay, so the theme was Frankenstein? All right, so the theme is Frankenstein, and what you really want to talk about is Anne of Green Gables. I would say just tell them what you want to say about Anne of Green Gables, and if there's some kind of connection you want to make to Frankenstein, then go for it, or not. I mean, because as you said, there were things on the program that were not about Frankenstein. So I wouldn't stretch myself very far to, to make it fit. Just tell them what you have to say. You're knowledgeable, you're passionate, you're smart, you've got things to say, just sell that.
There's no sort of like obligation to like force the connection if it's gonna make your topic.
I wouldn't think so. I mean, you might not get accepted if it seems off topic, but apparently at that conference, people were smart enough to include things that were valuable that were not on the topic. So.
It's gotta feel organic. If it feels artificial and forced, right?
Yeah.
Then it's,
Okay, so a couple of things that we didn't talk about. Wait, were there other questions before I? Okay, what do we think of the number of conferences and what kinds you should go to?
I'm going to dissent from the one line on your CV per month rule. That seems way too much to me. And somebody was saying something about the job market. Okay, so something.
Yeah.
When I'm looking at a job applicant, which I do a fair amount, What I want to see is basically once a year they're doing something with a major organization. So the American Educational Research Association, the Council of Writing Program Administrators, 4 Cs, NCTE, or whatever your field is. If they're in the conversation once a year at a high-profile conference, I'm pretty much good with that. If there are publications to add to that, that's fantastic. So I'm kind of maybe at the other end of the spectrum on the, many lines on the CV thing. For me, quality and prominence are at least equally valuable.
Do you look for sort of, especially because we're dealing with rhetoric and composition, are you looking for people to have been to several different conferences? Like if they're going to only 4 Cs every year, is that problematic for you or no?
It's a good question. Yes and no. I wouldn't be a showstopper if somebody only went to one conference, but there is a nice thing about if you're going to more than one prominent conference. It shows a kind of breadth, intellectual and professional breadth, that's appealing.
Can I add something really quickly that somebody said to me, and I don't know if it's true of all fields or whatever, but for me, in my work, so some smaller aspects of bigger conferences or smaller conferences are more important on my CV in theory for the kinds of jobs I want to get, how I'm selling myself as a scholar. So say one year I did a smaller sort of poster presentation at like the 7 Cs at 4 Cs. So I wasn't presenting at 4 Cs that year, but to people who are digital rhetoric computers and writing people, that means more to them that I was part of that. Does that make sense? So so I guess the advice that was given to me is knowing what matters to the people in the area that you're actually looking to work in is important, and that requires talking to people. I think you can't probably just get to that on your own. It's different,
Yeah, I was told something similar to that, and also the idea that if you shoot for 2 a year, 2 conferences a year, one major one like CHLA or IRCL or the 4 Cs, whatever your field is, and then one that's different. Once, so that you can have your big 4 Cs or your CHLA or whatever every single year and go there consistently and keep up with those people, but then also your other one is to try something different.
Yeah, and I also think it's really the Pop Culture Association conference. That's the one that I went to in Seattle, and I presented on Lemony Snicket in the children's literature division. So it wasn't a children's literature conference, but I was still doing something that was in my field, and I think it can be nice to do things where it shows that you can be interdisciplinary, how you can bring in your stuff into other fields. So one of the notes that I had made previously that I forgot to say, of course, was that if you're kind of just figuring things out, look for interdisciplinary conferences, because then it's not one of those things where if you don't fit exactly, you feel like you're a square and there's a circle peg that circle hole that you're trying to go into, you can kind of figure those things out. And those were the conferences that I first started going to, because then I was like, okay, well, everyone's doing all kinds of different work, so if mine seems kind of weird, it can't be weirder than that person, so we'll just kind of figure it out. And so I didn't start going to children's literature stuff until much, much later. My first conference presentation was on medieval lit, so that's not what I do anymore. But anyway, the differences between graduate versus regular conferences, and when do you knock graduate conferences off of your CV?
When you've got something more prominent to put in their place.
How many?
Okay, so give me a scenario. You've been to 12 graduate student conferences and 4 international conferences. You want to know numerically, what?
Well, I was just wondering, because when I first started out, as just, some grad conferences. So I have two or three of those from several years back. But then the last 12 that I've been to have all been national or international. So do I knock those 3 off at this point?
I would. I would let them go.
The length of the CV, just
Yeah.
want more lines.
Right. No. Yeah, I'm with Hamish. I mean, people are going to notice the difference, and if you've got a dozen, prominent conferences, then that's fantastic.
I just didn't know if we were going for length or value or what the deal is. I just want someone to pay me.
But you should keep a master CV with everything you've done,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Whether or not that leaves you
Right.
is different.
Yeah, because if you have one copy and you just keep deleting things, and then you're like, actually, I did that thing 3 years ago, and it would have been good for this particular thing, but now I don't remember what I did. Like, just keep all of the stuff, and then have one that you just kind of fix.
I would like to throw in a thought here, and this is building on something that's said at least a couple of times earlier. Conferences are fantastic things in and of themselves. They are, we always use the metaphor of the conversation, the professional conversation. They are actual conversations, so they're great for all of those reasons. It's my strong view that when you present something at a conference, it should turn into a publication or an effort toward a publication. That is just a good use of your time and a good use of the engagement and the response that you will get at the conference, as people have articulated already.
I don't think there were any other questions. I did note the thing with the schmoozing. We will have a whole panel on that, so a whole forum on that.
Just the difference between proposal and abstract.
Oh, yes.
Or how to write one.
Or write a good one.
Yeah, how to write a particularly good one, not a bad one.
So I feel like in children's, I feel like I use them interchangeably, but in other places, in other fields, are proposal and abstracts different? I guess I would just put that out there.
Well, you propose a panel. Panels sometimes have abstracts.
I feel like there's like a tense in the wording, like a proposal saying I will do this thing, and an abstract is saying I have done this thing.
Okay. I respect it.
But I think Krista's, or everyone's right, like I think you see it very differently at different conference
Right.
proposal submission systems, like.
I think you were the one who
I think
mentioned
we
that.
often, I think in rhetoric and composition, we talk about writing a proposal. We don't talk about it as an abstract, but sometimes when you get in there to propose a conference, there is a box for putting your abstract of your panel in. But I think what Shelby just said is different. It's different than thinking about submitting an abstract of a paper I've written. But yeah, they are used pretty interchangeably.
I think too, it also depends on like some conferences, they expect you to have everything sort of figured out before you apply as a group or whatever. Some you just send in a thing into a void.
There was one where I had to send my paper in a month ahead of time.
Yeah.
And that was the one where I had to explain my paper rather than like read it. And so we were supposed to have sent it in so that the other people on the panel, we could all have read each other's papers, and it would be more of a conversation, which was a very weird experience, but also valuable.
It seemed like somebody was wondering about, like, can you propose just your paper, or does it need to be part of a panel? So again, from my perspective, both things are possible. As a practical fact, it's universally understood that your odds are better when you're proposing a panel, because if you're proposing if you submit an individual presentation, that relies, there's an extra step to getting accepted. Number one, they're going to look at how good your presentation proposal is, but then they're going to try to figure out if they can fit you with others.
Yeah.
If they can't fit you with others, they're not going to put you in an uncomfortable situation where you're on a panel and nobody can figure out why you're together. So that's not a reason not to submit a solo proposal, but it's a little tougher to get on the program that way.
Yes, and I noted that in minutes.
I have 3 things when I'm writing an abstract that I make sure that I have. And they vary in length depending on the conference. I've seen some 500, and then some as low as like 250, which the smaller ones are worse, I think.
Yeah. I have too much to say.
I make sure that I've got context, and I tell them what I am using and how I'm using it. So I know that the person reading my paper may not be a specialist in 18th century illness narratives, so I got to give them a little bit of background, like how is this, why am I even using this? what am I using, and then how am I using it? And that's, I guess, in literature, primary and secondary texts. You can do a lot of signposting that you're a member of the conversation. If you know a big name in the field, don't necessarily think of it as name dropping, but idea or concept dropping. Of like, this is the thing I'm going to play with at the conference, and this is what I'm going to use to play with it.
Yeah, I try to write as if the person might know what I'm talking about. Like, they might have some knowledge. So, like, if I'm doing for children's literature, like, you're going to know who Roberta Trites is in children's literature. But you might not know every single piece that she's written, right? So I try to write as if the person probably knows what I would be talking about, but just to be clear, I'm going to make sure that you understand why I'm using what I'm using, how I'm going to go about using it, and like all the context things so that like you will know how I'm fitting into this conversation and how it will all come together. Just because you don't know what people's uptake will be. I think I used uptake and antecedent knowledge in these notes like 5 times. Oh, and then the other thing I'll say is I can be really terrible about waiting to the last minute to do things, including writing abstracts and including writing papers. Don't be like me. Be better. Be better than me, because it really can help to have other people read your stuff. And like, I know we say this all the time, but like Carly, if you knew who Carly Rodriguez was, she was another grad student, but she and I did very, very different things. And so we would always switch papers because she could point out to me the places where she was like, I don't really know what you're talking about here, which means that if someone doesn't do my research, that's an area where I need to talk about that. So not only your papers, but also your abstracts, having other people read them so you can fine tune and make sure you don't have those holes, so that like you're not just hoping that someone actually knows what is inside your brain, because no one can do that. Maybe the government, but anyway.
Any other questions? Or tips or anything?
Did we talk about the difference between grad and regular conferences? Like, I mean, maybe I know that like they're geared towards grad students, but like, I guess I just don't really know. Like, are they like easier to get into?
Yes.
Or?
Yep.
Okay.
I guess from my perspective, it's sort of like I think people tell you to apply to grad conferences if you haven't done them before, so you can get the experience of kind of doing that. And so that less high stakes environment, which I don't need to get on. Anyway, yes, so that.
If you just attend a conference, which I recommend because I find it's low pressure and nice to just kind of get, it's been nice to just get the exposure. But when you just attend them and you don't present, do you put them on your CV?
No.
I was like,
You didn't do any of the intellectual labor there?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
To volunteer though.
Yeah.
I don't know, in the case of like
There's different for
C's
places.
this year, some people who were accepted have declined but are still putting on their CVs because of like political reasons,
Okay.
so.
Oh yeah, I'm one of those people.
Yeah,
So
same.
yeah.
So
I've
there are
had,
instances where you-
yeah, I've had like
But then
so.
you wouldn't attend, right?
Right, you put accepted, but you don't put attention.
Right.
Yeah.
So especially if you've had one of those situations where you've been accepted to a conference and you have to submit your CV somewhere, but you haven't actually presented yet, I've had my professors like suggest that I've just put accepted. And also, if you have like volunteered at a conference, like even if you didn't like present, like putting that on there. But as you go forward, those, rather than just having that like all your conferences together, you'll have those things separated out. So it'll be clear where you presented, but also where you did that sort of service volunteer work.
Shannon, will you explain the political thing? Because I think people will find that interesting, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there was just a big debate, because some of you may know, the NAACP put out a travel warning to Missouri because of racial tensions. And this year, CBP hosted in Kansas City. So there was a lot of debate after people had already submitted their presentations or proposals. There's a lot of debate about whether or not it should be moved, whether it should be canceled. I know C's, the committee, and NCT had a whole lot of discussion about it. It was on social media a lot, but they ultimately decided to hold it there and to continue forward with the conference. But a lot of people did not want to attend because they felt either they wouldn't be safe or they were in solidarity with other people. So it was kind of a whole thing about whether or not you should attend. And I know for graduate students especially, there was a lot of conversation on Twitter about like, well, we're kind of supposed to go to CESA for in rhetoric, and this is the one we were accepted to, but you know, in solidarity with somebody else in the field who we're working with, we don't feel that we should go. So it was a lot of stuff. So a lot of people, what they're doing is if they were accepted, they're putting a line saying that they were accepted, but that they did not attend for that reason.
Some of it's out of protest too, about the way that they handled it, or the perception of how it was handled, that a lot of people's opinions weren't really, that there was lip service to people's feelings about the whole thing and no action.
Yeah.
And so people who feel strongly, and if you're trying to, or like Shannon and I, if you try to put yourself out there as a social justice person, it's kind of, how can you, in good conscience, attend something knowing that.
And an amazing additional dimension, which might or might not be ironic, is that Asao Inoue, the chair of this year's conference, is, I think it's fair to say, the most race-conscious scholar in writing studies that I'm aware of currently. And so here he finds himself in the forefront of this basically impossible situation.
But as far as showing up at a conference completely neutral of political and then putting on your CV that you went and listened to a presentation, I don't think that would be appropriate.
Yeah, hopefully you'll have a lot more substantive things that you can put. It's not that it's a bad thing, it's a great thing to go to conferences, but hopefully you have presentations you can put on there.
I suppose it should be mentioned, I mean, the department will still give you money if you're just going to most of the time.
Because it's a travel, it's a travel thing, but they
You only
prioritize.
get to use your $200 some way, so.
They make sure you did it.
Make sure you.
$156 and 12
I was about to say.
This year it was, yeah.
Okay.
Anything else?
One other thing I was just thinking of, because you said the thing about reading it out loud, right? I do this with my poetry when I perform it, but also it holds true with papers. If there's a line that you keep tripping over, perhaps that line needs to be revised. Because there's, like if your brain isn't processing it for whatever reason, it's probably poorly worded. So just for what that's worth, when you're practicing, notice the things that don't, and not just because you're using like a big word, but because like the syntax isn't working.
It was a lot of fun visiting with you all today. Thanks.
There's things that I've read, I'm like, that's a bomb ass sentence. And then I read it out loud and I'm like, what is that?
Anybody else? Going once? Twice? Done. Alright, this is a great conversation, and I'm hoping that Matt and Katie, you're going to send me these things, and I'm going to make the audio and notes available.
Yes.
Potentially via Facebook if I can figure out how to do that. And otherwise, come back for networking as it will build on the conversation we've had today. But I have 5 minutes to get the key downstairs, so
Get out.
everybody continue your conversation in the hallway.